Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Kaylee Byers. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University and a senior scientist. I'm coming through my own laptop. It's okay. By the last one, we're going to have everything, all the text up, completely sorted out. And I'm a senior scientist with the Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics, and Society at Simon Fraser University. And this is our fourth installment of the President's Dream Colloquium in One Health. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to everyone joining us online. I really want to thank our sponsors for the series. Simon Fraser University, we have funding from the Faculty of Science, Faculty of Environment, Faculty of Health Sciences, support from CanMod, and the Pacific Institute on Pathogens, Pandemics, and Society, among so many other partners. And this series would not be possible without all of their support. So thank you so much, both for your generous financial support and just for your general support for the event. A few things that I'd like to walk us through. We have one more session in the series that is coming up next week. So we have one more April 4th with Ed Young, who has won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. We're really excited about this series. So there's still, I think, some spots available online that you can go check out. And we have two past talks that are also available online. The first from Dr. Salome Bucacci on One Health and the Changing Global Health Landscape, and the other from Dr. Mark Lipsitch, what are the benefits of viral prospecting in non-human animals? So you can go find those online if you'd like to see some of the past talks. And this is just a look at everyone who's coming to speak as part of this series. We've got a really incredible roundup of folks. So in addition to everyone who's joining us in the auditorium tonight, we have quite a few folks joining us online. We have folks joining us from across Canada, Mexico, Nigeria, Kenya, Malaysia, Australia, India, Jordan, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Wow. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. And just for the evening, we also have live captioning and American Sign Language and interpreting, which are available on Zoom. So to turn on captioning, click the CC live caption button at the bottom of your screen. You can also adjust the size of the font by clicking the three dots at the bottom of your window that say More and selecting Subtitle Settings. Our sign language interpreters are Carmen and Liz. Thank you so much, Carmen and Liz. They should appear as panelists on your screen. If you experience any issues accessing the captions or interpreters, please send us an email to dream, D-R-E-A-M, @sfu.ca. We also want to invite everybody to please submit questions. We'll call for questions in the room, but also submit your questions online. And you can do that in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So we are thrilled to have you join us for the President's Dream Colloquium in One Health. The concept of One Health recognizes the interconnected health of people, animals, and the environment, right? Our health is not just about us, it is about the health of everything around us. And this idea is not new. It's sort of been recognized in Western science for maybe the last 50, 60 years. But this concept of interconnected health is reflected in many Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing. These knowledges and practices are also rooted in the places where we are. So tonight I want to respectfully acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded ancestral and territorial lands of the Coast Salish people. And while I'm joining you right now from the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, SFU's campuses also reside on the lands of the Katzie, Kwikwetlam, Kakite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples. In today's talk, we're going to be learning about how past decisions influence the present and the future. And in our very first opening to the President's Dream Colloquium, Elder Marie Hooper shared with us this phrase in Hunkamitnam that is not sumat, or one mind, one heart. And it talks about our connections to each other, but Elder Marie also talked about our responsibilities. And I've been reflecting on that in advance of Dr. Schell's talk today, because I think the concept that he's going to talk about to you all is really connected to that. What are our responsibilities to each other, not just as people, but also to the planet and the animals on it with us. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Naomi Krogman, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Environment, who will be introducing Dr. Schell.
Thank you, Kaylee. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this President's Colloquium lecture. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Chris Schell for this President's Dream Colloquium. Dr. Christopher Schell is an urban ecologist, an Afrofuturist, a father, and a writer. Chris is also an assistant professor at Berkeley in California in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Research in the Schell Lab combines animal behavior, physiology, urban biodiversity conservation, environmental justice, and One Health to investigate how carnivores, namely coyotes, foxes, and raccoons, adapt to life in cities. In addition, Schell's lab integrates critical discourses on how structural oppression, that is, redlining, pollution burdens, and socioeconomic disparities, directly shape the very urban features associated with human-wildlife interactions, conflict, and adaptation. Dr. Schell's transdisciplinary work aims to disentangle how environmental injustices have structured our urban ecosystems and how we can harness those lessons to build a more just, biodiverse, and resilient set of cities. After having lunch with him today, I enjoyed hearing about the many connections he makes to an earlier talk today that we heard by Jason Brown on leaning into ecological grief. Indeed, while Jason Brown pointed out to grieve losses to nature is to demonstrate love for nature, Chris pointed out that to love nature is to come to know and feel a sense of belonging to our home, the ecosystem where we live. Schell is a National Geographic explorer, a grist fixer, Cal Academy fellow, and board member and affiliate faculty with the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, where his work has been featured in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Vox Explained, and various NPR radio events. A born and raised Los Angelino, now firmly planted in the Bay Area, Schell weaves his lived experiences as a Black man and Californian to co-produce justice and equity-centered research programs with local communities that regenerate urban nature, environmental health, and access for all peoples. Chris, on behalf of SFU, I welcome you to the podium.
First off, I just want to say I really appreciate y'all, appreciate the time. Thank you for bringing me to Vancouver for the first time. It is quite an extraordinary city, one that I wish I had more time to enjoy and experience. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for bringing me here for this colloquium. I am superbly honored. And I'm really honored to be able to have this conversation with you all today, in large part because it's one like many of y'all have gotten a chance to talk about in the past that connects us all. One that maybe you may not necessarily see as a connection between us and the racism and sexism and classism that exists in our societies and how it reverberates outside of those societies, outside of just human beings, but influences all of the non-human entities around us. So I titled the talk today, Cities of Futures Past, Examining the Social-Ecological Legacies Affecting Urban Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health. For those of you that are comic book fans, and there will be many of those references, because in my classes, I like to weave in a lot of pop culture narratives with a lot of the kind of science narratives to try and really build these cognitive bridges to help y'all understand. There was this extraordinary comic book arc around X-Men and Days of Future Past, and this idea that there was a future that existed that got so dystopian that Professor X had to send several X-Men to the past in order to try and change things in the past to influence the present and lead to a different future. So I hope for y'all today, we're gonna do a little bit of time traveling, all right? We're gonna be like the X-Men, where we think about our past, present, and future interchangeably, all at the same time. So in that way, we can better understand how we can build better futures, so we can learn from the past, so we start to enjoy the present. Because as we heard, whether it be in the ecological grief talk earlier today, or likely other talks you all have heard, there seems to be quite a bit of despair, right? So let's dare to dream. Let's dare to hope. Before I do that, though, I think it's important for me to start with a definition. As an ecologist, I like to remind folks that ecology as a field at its base level is the study of organisms' relationships to the environment and relationships to other organisms. The field is fundamentally based in understanding our relationships with each other, right? Not only that, the Greek word oikos is where ecology was derived from, which means home. So in essence, as an ecologist, I like to think of myself as studying relationships in home. That is sacred. If y'all think about your homes, right? You think like, man, that home, that place is my refuge. That's a place where I get a chance to rest. That's a place where I get a chance to breathe, to love, to eat, to do the things that help sustain me. That is the same case for all other organisms, right? So by studying ecology, we get to study those relationships. And if I were to make a twist to that, urban ecology then is examining the interconnectedness of both the non-human and human organisms in these human-dominated spaces. Just to break the fourth wall a little bit, as an urban ecologist, I oftentimes, and still to this day, are looked at funny because other traditional ecologists will say, there's no way in hell you can do legitimate ecology in a human-dominated environment. Human beings destroy everything that they touch. We're obviously going to break that today. So just so y'all are ready for that, right? Urban ecology intentionally puts people back into the equation and says, we have not been removed, regardless of whatever level of false objectivity we think we have. We have never been removed from the equation. So what does it look like if we put ourselves back into that equation? That's what this talk is going to be about. So I have the pleasure of performing a job where I get to see these wildlife species like the raccoons and the deer and the wild turkeys and the coyotes. The videos are a little stilty, but it doesn't matter. You can see them. The point still remains that these animals are navigating these spaces that were created for us, by us. These human-dominated environments were created in ways that help to sustain human life, and yet, in many instances, we completely overlook all of the other organisms that live in and around us. I'd just like to point out that, and if the raccoon video is the only one that's working, that's perfect. Why? Because look at these bad boys up here, right? They had no care in the world. This video in particular was taken in San Francisco, Lake Merced, for those of you that have been to San Francisco, and you probably can tell they have likely been fed by people a lot. It was at 11 a.m. in the morning when I saw them. I pulled up and they could not care less that my car was there. In fact, some of the animals, right, that one in particular that you saw that was digging and rooting around, stopped when I stopped the car, which is just a telltale sign that they likely have been fed by people. But in almost every video that we have been able to capture when we're out in the field doing our work, these animals are paying attention to us consistently, right? So it just goes to show, sort of as a visual representation, it is quite difficult for us to take ourselves out of the equation when all of the other organisms around us clearly see us. But should be noted, this is all happening while the planet is in fact in a biodiversity crisis. Make no bones about it, right? We are in an epoch where we are losing more species en masse than we have recently, so much so that it is labeled a mass extinction, the 6th that this planet has experienced. Just to give you guys some background information, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in 2019 came out with a report that essentially noted that of the 8 million species, animals and plants, that exist on this planet. Around 1 million of them are threatened with extinction. 1/8 of the species that we currently have on this planet are likely to die by 2100. That's a lot. And these species are critical for ecosystem function. When I was a kid, I would watch Bill Nye the Science Guy. And one of the best episodes he ever had was one where he put together this big Jenga set with the oversized blocks. You remember those ones from when you were a kid, right? And he would put images of different species like the ones you see up here on each of the blocks to demonstrate something, that all of these species collected together help maintain the stability of the ecosystem, the tower being the ecosystem. So if you remove one species, then another species, then another species. Some of y'all are getting anxious right now because you play Jenga and you're like, the tower is about to fall. Stop removing the blocks. That's exactly what Bill Nye was trying to illustrate, that our ecosystems are dependent on the collective network of species that all come together in this Jenga tower. Remove too many of those species out of the system, the entire ecosystem collapses. We too are blocks in this ecosystem. And all of the organisms together as our collective non-human kin are helping us to stay alive. They're helping us to remain and stay healthy. So this is the first Marvel reference. There are two others. This one is just taken off of the Falcon and Winter Soldier that was on Disney Plus, but it's apropos to talk about biodiversity as our shield, right? Essentially as the entities and organisms that constitute a stable ecosystem that remain and stay in homeostasis. This ability to maintain stability that provides all of the services that we derive from the animals just existing in the space. Whether those services be things like regulating services, or supporting, or provisioning, or even cultural services. The ways in which we intersect with these animals are in so many multitudes that we certainly need to give credence where credence is due. Plainly put, these animals help us to maintain ourselves. They are all of the organisms that allow us to have a home. So for all of those reasons, especially for this dream colloquium, it's important to think of not just human beings as maintaining health, but that, as a reminder, as Kaylee had mentioned, our health is intimately tied to the health of the environment and to the health of the other organisms that we share this planet with. And y'all can see this equation. Any dysregulation in any of those three domains will lead to the collapse of the others. Imagine, for instance, a stool that has 3 different legs, and you chop one of those legs in half. What's going to happen if you sit in that stool? Right? Human society on that stool is teetering because we constantly keep shaving off pieces of those legs without understanding the full repercussions. So this figure, for instance, is just one that was taken from a paper that Kaylee and I had put together with Dr. Maureen Murray and trying to understand how One Health and environmental justice intimately intersect with each other. Because under this specific diagram, without understanding the ways in which justice helps to scaffold, right, provides the glue that allows for that stool to exist and stay intact, we don't have the ability to have stability. We constantly are moving back and forth without a foundation. So for all of those reasons, that's exactly why in 2020, for the Kunming Montreal Biodiversity Conference, COP15 came together, where more than 190 member nations all sat down to develop 23 ambitious targets to try and understand, halt, and mitigate biodiversity loss. Many of those issues were targeting the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, whether it be the amount of land use change that is existent from human society, or pollution, or direct exploitation, and so on and so on. And only one of the 23 ambitious targets had anything to do with cities. So here's where we transition a little bit to say, I am certain that y'all have heard of the narratives around cities being these biological wastelands, right? That wherever we create cities, essentially death just follows, and no other organisms can live in cities, only human beings can. That falls under this implicit assumption known as the biological deserts fallacy. That somehow, for some reason, these areas where we have set up shop don't have any other species, which feeds into many ecologists' views of why we shouldn't be studying cities in the first place. Because they think, well, why would you do that? All of the other organisms that live in these areas tend to be relatively depauperate, and they're already on their way out anyway. Let's try and conserve the spaces that we know haven't been impacted by people. Well, here is one of the fundamental tenets of urban ecology. Human beings are the directors, the actors, and the audience of this adapted screenplay. I like to joke that we are the Lin-Manuel Miranda of this joint, right? Not only did we cast all of the cast members, we composed all the songs, we even put together that cool rotating stage, right? We also are singing in this play. We also are acting in this joint, and we're seeing how it unfolds as we sit in our seats at the same time. As human beings, being the most impactful species on the planet, we are seeing everything from every single angle. But you may be like, all right, cool. How exactly does conservation then contribute or is part of the city narrative? Let me give you some stats real quick. First stat, just a matter of fact, there are more people living in cities on this planet than anywhere else in any other human-dominated ecosystem. 55% and counting of the entire human population lives in a city. It's going to be 68% by the time we get to 2050. Oh, and the population is going to increase by another 2.5 billion with a B. So it's really hard to look away from cities when that's where most of the people are going to be. Another breaking of the fourth wall here. Part of the work that we do is important in cities. Why? Because if most of the human population is in cities, and most of the human population also deals with this thing called capitalism, we'll get to that in a little bit, right? Then how exactly are you going to fund conservation initiatives if you completely ignore 7/10 of the entire human population? Think about that for a second. So most people live in cities. We should probably care about cities because we should be caring about people. This stat kind of flows from the last one. New urban land cover is projected to increase anywhere from 0.82 to 1.53 million kilometers squared. New urban land cover. Y'all may be like, Chris, I don't know what any of those numbers mean. Can you put that in context? I got you. I got you. All right. That is equivalent to adding 635 to 1,185 new Los Angeles metro areas across the globe. Take 1,000 new LAs, put them everywhere, and be like, cool, all you other non-human organisms, get with it. You can deal with that, right? New cities by 2050, y'all. Finally, and perhaps the most important that is directly linked back to biodiversity. 463 major cities, 300,000 people or more, are located in biodiversity hotspots. These areas that have a mix of biotic and abiotic factors that essentially constitute an ecosystem with enough ecological niches to have a variety of species, a species radiation, if you will, right? Where rare species are only found in those certain areas. Many of these major cities harbor species that aren't found anywhere else in the world. And these cities were put here on purpose, not by accident. We build our cities in places where the number of abiotic resources and biotic resources, right? All those ecosystem services we just talked about a few slides ago, they exist in the same places that our cities are in. Because Again, reminder, we're part of this planet. So we also subsist on the same resources that many of these other biodiverse species do as well. So when you put yourself back into the narrative, you understand, right? Like human beings are not separate from this. In fact, we have been building in places that have life, that are teeming with different species and organisms. And therefore, maybe it's good to understand how we redefine our relationships with these organisms, huh? So, a little bit of an exercise. I do this with my class all the time. And yes, it's a semi-quiz, but all of you guys are going to ace it. It's easy. Second Marvel reference. Groot, which is a really good one because we're going to talk about trees, right? So what I'm going to have y'all do, I'm going to ask you some questions that get to this larger question. Do trees grow on money? I'm going to have you follow the trees in this next set of slides. I'm going to be Groot. Y'all are going to be Groot. We are going to be Groot. And I'm going to ask you to point. I'm going to ask you to point to the left or the right when I ask you a set of 2 questions. You ready? Are my Groots ready? Y'all good? Okay, solid. Groot. Yeah, there you go. I didn't hear I am Groot there. There you go. All right. So let me describe these 2 neighborhoods for you real quick. The neighborhood that y'all have over here on your left is of University Place in Tacoma. Not too far from here, right? About a maybe 4-hour drive. That's to the southwestern part of downtown Tacoma. This image over here on your right is of Southeast Tacoma, which coincidentally is actually just directly south of the downtown region in Tacoma. These 2 neighborhoods are no more than a half mile apart from each other. Your first question, if I were to ask you which of these 2 neighborhoods would you say has a higher vegetation cover, you would point to which one? Okay, that was easy. You all got that one. Solid. If I were to ask you the follow-up question and then say, of these 2 neighborhoods, which would you expect to have a higher median household income? You would point to? Most of y'all said to the left, although there was a little bit of puzzle in there, which I'm excited to dig into for this Q&A. This inherent implicit assumption that you have, that the amount of socioeconomic wealth is positively correlated with the amount of vegetation in a neighborhood. It has a name called the luxury effect. This idea that species richness, or the number of species that we're able to document in a given area, oftentimes positively correlates with socioeconomic wealth. Now, that's not always the case, and we're going to break that down here in a little bit, but it should be noted that this luxury effect is found at every single trophic level, from the primary producers all the way up to the tertiary consumers. And this is outdated. I actually need to update it, and it's only been a few months, but already there have been several additional studies demonstrating at multiple ecological levels that socioeconomic wealth has some level of association with what species are where and at what quantities. Now that matters a whole lot, because that means that at a certain level, if we're thinking about biodiversity and the way in which a system is constructed and how having greater biodiversity confers greater ecosystem services and benefits, that means that those without or those lacking socioeconomic resources also do not have the same level of protection. They don't have the shield, right? This is a level of protection y'all may not have even known you had, just because we have access to wealth. One of those things that we take for granted. So we didn't want to rest on our laurels, even though we did a review on this and we were very much curious about what was happening in the system. The thing with the luxury effect studies in the past is that all of them, like y'all have probably heard, right? You will do a study in one space, you'll do the analysis, you'll do the write-up, you'll come to certain conclusions, you'll call it a day. Somebody comes in a year or 2 or 3 later, does the same study, different location, different results, different conclusions. And we said, bump that. Why don't we just actually come together as a larger consortium of researchers and do it all together at the same time. So several colleagues and myself under what we call the Urban Wildlife Information Network, or UN, did just that. We used data from 20 cities collected from 2013 to 2019 using really simple camera traps. Honestly, no bigger than this jar of water right here. Placed them all over the city for 6 years and saw what animals we were able to detect and whether or not those detections varied as a function of income gradients. Now, it should be noted that now in the year 2024, we've moved in the last 10 years to 54 cities, including those outside of the United States, including here in Vancouver, right? So this is a consortium that continues to grow, that allows us to understand how humans and wildlife coexist in these spaces. But for this study in particular that we published in 2021, we were able to both approximate human footprint and median household income, combine those two, and take a look at the relative contributions of each of those environmental covariates on biodiversity. Here specifically, species richness. Happy to talk to you more about the Bayesian framework later. The gist, we had a bunch of fun setting up cameras like this, right? Just like posting up in areas where you can't see behind the camera, you can't see behind this fourth wall, but there was a road right there. There are areas where we would set up cameras where they were ultra pristine. Think, and maybe this isn't a good example because I haven't been in Vancouver long enough, Stanley Park versus any park outside a few blocks away. So we put cameras everywhere where we think we could potentially get these animals. And what did we find? Now, I'm going to tell you this is going to be a no-duh result, but it just stands to reason that me putting it out there and telling y'all, as we did this study, showing that there is variation is important, right? So we saw that there was variation in relation to these income gradients. I'm going to show you one of the figures from that paper that we had published in 2021. On the x-axis is this correlation between species richness and a city's income gradient. If you tended to slide over here to the right of this dashed line, and that blue shaded area of the normal distribution curve did not overlap that dashed line, then that means that we saw a positive relationship like we would expect. So increased socioeconomic status, increased species richness. And what did we see for some of these cities? Well, St. Louis, Seattle, Jackson, Phoenix, right? Let your eye kind of travel from the top to the bottom. In fact, for some of these cities, we did see this relationship where the wealthier neighborhoods did have more species. But the further your eye goes down that line, you start to realize, that's not the case for every city. So as soon as we start getting into Wilmington, Delaware, that relationship is null and void. Again, this is a no-duh relationship. There may be some species that are way more sensitive to the cues that are associated with socioeconomic status relative to others. Good example, mountain lions, right? They're not found in every single city, and even though we put in offsets for mountain lions in our models, certainly mountain lions are bougie. They will like to be in the areas that have greater, larger contiguous habitat. Same thing with black-tailed deer. But raccoons do not care. Not one bit, right? And they'll be wherever they can be. So there are species-specific differences as well. So this helps us to start unpacking this luxury effect. It's not the case everywhere. It's not the case for all cities. And a recent meta-analysis that was done by Evan Kuras, Paige Warren, and company, several of our colleagues were interested in digging into this luxury effects for so many reasons, right? But the biggest one being that wealth isn't always the best proxy or predictor of where organisms are going to be. So what our colleagues did was take all of the papers that had published on the luxury effect to date. They split up the papers by flora, plants, and fauna, animals. And then they further did some more partitioning. They partitioned by whether or not the city was dense or sparse. Think Manhattan versus Los Angeles. They also they partitioned the data by a positive relationship like we would expect, right? Greater wealth, more species, a neutral relationship, no relationship at all, or negative relationship, more wealth, less species. Good example may be somewhere deep in the downtown areas of, well, any city that are extraordinarily expensive, but have very little access to green space. And when you look at mostly residential spaces for both flora and fauna, yeah, you see this positive relationship. But as soon as you start to slide into mixed and non-residential spaces, it's not so clear anymore. So there doesn't always seem to be this positive relationship between wealth and biodiversity. And that had us dig even further. Third Marvel reference. This one is from Avengers Endgame. Why do I use this one exactly? Well, I did tell you that we were going to time travel because just looking at contemporary wealth doesn't start to dig out the ways in which that wealth came to be. If we want to understand the relationships between social and ecological covariance, then we can't just rest on what exists at the present. We have to learn lessons from the past so we can start building solutions towards the future, which is part of the reason that I used one of the many time travel references in all of science fiction, but this one is perhaps my favorite, especially when you see Rocket Raccoon right there. So, just so happens that there has been a hypothesis hiding in plain sight in the ecological literature for a long time. Legacy effects. This idea that there are long-lasting impacts on the ecosystem even after an organism has left. A really good example, and the reason I have this photo up here, is of agriculture, right? So imagine we transform a habitat to an agricultural field for food, crops, for livestock. If we were to leave all of those fields today, it would still take centuries for each of those ecosystems to recover. Hence, human legacies have long-lasting impacts on the recovery and successional processes that exist in those ecosystems. Also important to note that legacy effects help us bridge space and time because they underscore how profound these impacts can be on an ecosystem's ability to change. So not just the state at where it is, but the dynamic processes that influence where it can be. And Ramalho and Hobbs, in a paper in Tree in 2012, really started to unpack how we think about space and time with human beings on the landscape, where the more disturbance, the more upheaval that we put on that landscape, the longer it takes for that ecosystem to come back. And in many ways, it doesn't come back the way that it was, which is important to note for all conservationists, right? Oftentimes, the conservation model is trying to go back to something that once was. And unfortunately, legacy effects oftentimes tell us that going back to what was isn't always the ability that we think we have. So for us, that led us to these maps right here. Maps that we see on a daily basis in my lab. Redlining. Now, for those of y'all that are Canadian, you may not have heard of what redlining is, right? But briefly, redlining was the policy that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, sanctioned by the US government in the 1930s, and existed all the way up until the 1960s when it was abolished by the Civil Rights Act, where they were codifying by law specific places that people of color, especially Black people, could live. And most of those places were oftentimes proximal to industrial sites, waste sites, pollutants, so on and so on. So redlining, the term, comes from these red regions, which were redlined, sandwiched up against these yellow regions as well, which, according to the HOLC designation, were C and D. Whereas the green and the blue areas, A and B respectively, were the areas that were reserved for wealthy white Americans. Now, this was all the case even if you as a Black American were able to afford a home, right? So these policies essentially put into law all of the sanctions therein that said Black people couldn't get loans from the bank. They would be tailed by the police if they tried to get a home in a green lined area. If they still were able somehow to pass all of those barriers and buy a home, they would have a cross burned on their front lawn. Many of the job opportunities were further away from their neighborhoods. And if there was a neighborhood that didn't have any racial covenants or zoning, like say California, they would do it quick, fast, and in a hurry just to maintain the racial caste system that exists still to this day, even though these laws were abolished more than 50 years ago. Case in point, currently, I live in Richmond, California, a neighborhood that didn't have many of the racial covenants that existed at the time in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. But when these maps were created, they did it so fast, it broke your neck. Literally in 3 years, certain parts of Richmond that to this day still are predominantly Black and brown sanctioned them away from many of the job opportunities that were 1 to 2 hours drive, while at the same time putting petrochemical plants right there that still exist. So we ask questions like this one: are the legacy effects produced by these historical segregation maps associated with biological communities in the present? Because if we're going off of the definition of legacy effects in the ecological literature, then 50 years ain't that long, right? Many of the trees that are alive today outside of this building are much older than that. So it stands to reason that many of the ecological niches around us are those that were around 50 years ago. That's the case for many of the biomes that we intersect with. So we examine neighborhoods that look like this. Neighborhoods in the hills of Berkeley that have tons of green space and access to tennis courts and really big lawns. And look at neighborhoods like this in West Oakland, which sort of sadly, right, have decrees from the Black Panther Party that we're trying to work towards sovereignty, that we're trying to work towards housing and access to a healthy environment. All the more insulting that much of the monuments to them look like this. So if we take these green lined and red line areas, what do we find? Green line areas have more vegetation, less roads, less pollutants, cooler temperatures. Conversely, red line areas, less vegetation, more roads, more pollutants, warmer temperatures. The number of stressors and how they differ are staggering. Trying to live in a previously redlined neighborhood is extraordinarily difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult for people. Folks that live in redline neighborhoods are more likely to have cancer, higher rates of asthma, more likely to have earlier preterm births, more likely to have complications generally. Health outcomes are terrible for folks that currently live in previously redlined areas. So a recent study that was led by one of the graduate students in the lab, Cesar Estienne, and one of the postdocs in the lab, Christine Wilkinson, took the time to evaluate all of these metrics, abiotic and biotic, finding differences in these red line versus green line neighborhoods and how much pollution that those neighborhoods were experiencing, how much vegetation here as NDVI they were experiencing, how much noise those areas were experiencing. And even though we didn't find a result for urban heat, certainly there have been plenty of other studies that have done just that. So the number of disturbances that exist in specific neighborhoods that still to this day are low income or communities of color are high. Reminder, redlining maps were abolished more than 50 years ago. And this is still the case. These data are from 2023. So you may be like, all right, well, what does that mean for biodiversity exactly? We did just talk about home, right? Imagine, for instance, if you're in your home, somebody kicks down your door and says, like, I'm gonna build some roads through here. I'm gonna just like spray a bunch of pollution. I'm not doing the dishes, that's all on you, right? Like, I'm not doing any of the laundry. Here's all of my dirty laundry. And it says, I'm turning the heat up all the way and you're paying for all of it. How would you feel? Somebody ran up into your house and did that. So what do we see? Let's start with just sampling bias, because all of us at some level are scientists, right? Or we work with scientists, or we're artists that depict the way in which science is done. I'm going to tell y'all another no dumb moment. There's a lot of bias. There's a lot of bias in the data. How do we know that? These two figures that you see up here from papers that our colleagues and I have done recently have demonstrated the amount of biodiversity data that exists across these red line designations. And customarily, in almost every single city that has been redlined, there is more biodiversity data in the previously wealthy white neighborhoods. A lot more. And when you control for all of that bias, what do you start to see? There are many levels of bias, right? Social biases influence what species are documented where. So a recent framework paper that we had published just a few weeks ago talked about how our own biases influence where we go, what species we measure, how often we measure them, and who is doing the measurement. That influences what data exists where. We're going to get back to that point here in a little bit. So let's say we just control for all of the bias and who's collecting the data and how they're collecting the data. Even when we do all of that, redlining is still associated with a number of species that we're able to document, both alpha and beta diversity. Let me explain. So recently, again, one of the graduate students who's a freaking rock star, Cesar Estienne, led an effort for us to try and document across 4 major Californian cities how many species are found in A, B, C, and D regions. And for the most part, in these A and B regions that you see above my head, most of the species are found in that area. There is some variability. So for instance, in Oakland, the C grade areas tend to rival some of those A and B grade areas. But for the most part, there is greater diversity, more species, unique species we're able to count in those previously green line spaces relative to the red line areas. Not only that, the community composition, that's beta diversity, is fundamentally different for red line areas. Briefly put, for those of y'all that don't look at NMDS plots all day, what this is saying is that for red line areas, their community composition is much smaller. It's way more compact. The species that are found are extraordinarily more common, and we aren't able to document all of the species. Again, back to the bias. So if I were to summarize, in these green line neighborhoods, there's more biodiversity and more sampling effort relative to these red line neighborhoods where there's less biodiversity and less sampling effort. Y'all probably know this by now because you work in spaces where you directly intersect with people, and you know that data is power. And the more data you have, the more power you have, especially in a society that only gives you funding if you can build some type of quantitative model to say, here's what we have, conserve our spaces. So for the folks that don't have nearly as much access to data because of the baked-in biases, should be noted, right? A lot of the data that I just showed y'all is all data from community science efforts like iNaturalist and eBird. And most of the folks that report the most on those platforms tend to be wealthy and white because they have the luxury of time. They have the luxury of time. Somehow time is now a luxury where they are able to document species, but their own, whether conscious or unconscious biases, don't allow them to go into neighborhoods that they don't feel safe. Where we know that that language is coded because there are folks that don't look like them, so they don't go to those neighborhoods, so they don't document the biodiversity, so those neighborhoods don't get the data, so then they don't get the protections. They don't get the same level of protections, which makes them more and more and more vulnerable. Ecosystem services are the shield, right? Well, if the way that we get there is by getting biodiversity data, the folks that live in these previously redlined neighborhoods aren't getting the resources to shore up their shield. It's no wonder then that their health outcomes are far worse than those that live in other neighborhoods. So this bridges us to a concept that I think most, if not all of y'all vibe with. This idea that past societal legacies influence the present, and they're deeply rooted in systemic racism and colonialism. Factors like immigration policy, residential segregation, unjust zoning laws, law enforcement, that all intersect with each other, all have projections to all of these other characteristics of the environment that influence what species are where. Again, urban ecology reintegrates us back into the tapestry of this ecosystem. And if we do that, then we realize that when society is unstable, everything else around us is unstable. So, systemic oppression then, by that virtue, is a conservation issue. And social and economic injustices impede conservation progress therein. We aren't able to conserve spaces to better environmental health for us and our non-human kin if we are unable to understand how systemic oppression influences all of the things. So this is a photo of Bob Bullard, somebody who's been having these conversations for a long time. He's oftentimes regarded as the father of the environmental justice movement. Now, mind you, there were many other folks, especially women of color, that were doing quite a bit more. He tends to be in the front of this, right? But even before Bob Bullard, there were indigenous cultures that were having these conversations, right? And those conversations will continue into the future. So everything I've told you today is not new. In fact, everything I just told you is just the same exact thing that many of our elders have said, just with the tools of the colonizer. That's it. That's it. So none of this should be surprising, right? So if we dip back into the past, we start to understand if reclaiming our histories is the move that we make, we start to restore our own agency. We start to reclaim and reimagine our own futures. We reclaim sovereignty over our own futures. So when I say dip back into the past, now we're going to go back and forth all the time, right? Hopscotch. Some of these that I have up above here for you, and feel free to read them as you wish, are some of the cornerstone principles. Called principles for short. They are the principles of environmental justice. There are 17 of those bad boys. And I can tell you that most of them have not been followed. Number one, affirmation of ecological unity and interdependence free from destruction. We got there yet? How about number 7? Right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision making. 12, establish urban and rural policies that clean up, rebuild, and balance with nature. 16, I have a 5 and 8-year-old. Education of present and future generations in social and environmental issues. If all of these sound like battlegrounds where we haven't made an iota of progress, you're not wrong. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. And that's infuriating. All y'all should be mad about that. All y'all should be mad about the fact that we haven't made any progress, and these were developed in 1991. So, as is the case with frustration and anger, when it be, and maybe this is too forward of me to even say it, but righteous, and it motivates you, that's exactly what it did for my colleagues and I when we came together and said, what would it look like if we took this entire narrative and smacked it into a book, right? If we were to start and think about conservation, not just as it has been in the past, but what it can be, cities of futures past. So we included several authors, including Kaylee and others, to try and think about how we do conservation in a city, traditional conservation, right? Population dynamics, stress physiology, genotypes, and whatever. But then what about conservation for the city and with the city and of the city? What would it look like if we expanded this narrative out to think about us as part of this narrative and each one of us just being a component, right? So yeah, today I'm the one up here giving the talk. But I'd like to think that I'm part of a larger tapestry where we together as a collective unit are thinking about these spaces in different areas. I was academically raised as a biologist and ecologist. So I don't have the lexicon to speak to other issues that social scientists intimately know about. Frankly, right? Most of my PhD work was on puppies. I got the nickname Puppy PhD for a good reason. I like that title, right? But my wife, who's an anthropologist and a doula and a healthcare practitioner, that is infinitely harder. And yet we each have our roles to play. Kaylee and I had a conversation today about how the work that we do is a lot like putting together a film. We are all part of a production team, and everybody has a role in the production team. Yes, you see the frontline actors as the protagonists and the director and maybe the music composer, but there are hundreds of other folks behind the scenes doing the work. So let's continue to do the work. So with that, I'm going to acknowledge everybody in the Schell Lab, all the collaborators and co-authors that have been working with us, all the community partners that have put all of this work together, and all of y'all for kicking it with me at 7 o'clock at night for a talk. And I'll open up for any questions y'all got.
Chris, sorry, I know I'm like standing to the back. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Always incredible to have these conversations with you.
Appreciate you.
And thank you for coming all the way here to do it. For those who don't know, the President's Dream Colloquium is also a graduate course, and Monica Hoger, who's a student in the class, is going to lead the Q&A. And in advance of this talk tonight, the students in the class read our paper, One Health for All. And so they have prepared a few questions as well. Monica is going to be graduating in a couple of months with a master's in public policy and rocking a brand new pink power suit. So very excited. And with that, take it away, Monica.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, first question comes from my classmate Sevdi. She says, it seems that while One Health and environmental justice frameworks are discussed extensively in academic papers, like the one we read, the decisions regarding the environmental justice distribution ultimately lie in the hands of governors and policymakers. How can we improve science communication efforts to ensure that the principles of One Health, especially concerning environmental justice, are effectively communicated to and considered by policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, as an academic, I can say certainly when you have the power to create space to allow for diversity of approaches and thought and interdisciplinarity, make that space, right? So for me, as somebody who exists in this space, I know I have, albeit I'm not beyond the black hole threshold that is tenure, but still I can create the spaces that allow for people to kind of thrive in their own individuality while at the same time coming together as a community, right? But that's just one of many ways. I oftentimes tell many of my students to think about the ways in which art intersects with the work that we do, the way in which writing intersects, right? Case in point, one of the graduate seminars that I teach is creative writing and environmental science. And in that course, we take a lot of time starting at climate fiction, starting in areas where we can imagine and envision different futures, and then eventually come back to scientific writing to think about how do we take what we learned in the first part of the course to unpack many of the issues that we have here today. And then frankly, just thinking about how each of us has, again, a different role to play. So if governance and policy tends to be the biggest way to make those changes, some of us will be the scientists collecting the data to talk about that. And being really good at science communication is something that our lab really, really strives to do and to do well. So for instance, this talk is one that I think about a lot because how I disseminate the message, because I have been given this platform, is really important. And that means that I take the time to listen to folks that know a lot more than I do. So then that way I can be well versed. When they're like, all right, Chris, you know what to say, right? Anybody who is been in Black community knows that when you go back to your community, you be like, all right, my brother, you know what to say, right? Don't forget about this. You better say that. It's like that, making sure you have a supportive community that helps you grow and learn in that space. But it's hard. It's hard.
All right. That was great to hear. And speaking of involvement, I have another question from Wesley. It says that given that some instances of our animal and human interaction, like your research on the coyotes and raccoons, and also our own coyote activity in Stanley Park from a few years ago, may inspire some strong public opinions, do you have any examples of how to get public buy-in for governance decisions?
Empathy, straight up, right? We work in a city in San Francisco where I would say that it probably rivals Vancouver, where we have a lot of folks that either love or hate the animals, where we have a lot of people that see researchers as the villains in studying those animals. And I oftentimes, with many of the folks that have some preconceived notions of what the animals are, whether they be pests or they be the heroes of the story, that I just listen to their stories, which is not inherently difficult, right? Trying to connect with somebody about their story about wildlife is in fact the reason that I got into this in the first place. So if I take the time to hear what they have to say and say, oh, that's really interesting. You know, we found this other thing that kind of aligns with what you're saying, or, oh, we found this about the animals. It's funny how some of the animals are doing this in this neighborhood, but some of the animals are doing some other behavior in a different neighborhood. Isn't it really cool how we both can see different behaviors and try and understand how the environment influences those behaviors and how we influence the environment? So rather than kind of keep community members at arm's length, actually engage with them as scientists. And it's important to remember that even before I was academically trained as a scientist, I was a storyteller, just like everybody else. We grow up, when we're 3, 5 years old, we tell stories because we like to tell stories because we want to be understood in a deeper way. That's exactly what somebody who's 35 or 55 or 75 is trying to do. And they just want to tell their story. So just listening to them. Like that's the simplest thing, is listening to folks.
Speaking of stories, then Nilu from our class wants to know, can you share any successful examples where integrating environmental justice and One Health principles led to tangible improvements in community health outcomes or ecosystem services in urban areas?
Oh, yes, I got one to mention right now that's currently happening. So as a member of the board at the California Academy of Sciences, also as one of their science trustees, we have been working on a project called Reimagining SF, which essentially is providing a bunch of funds and initiatives from folks all across the city to try and think about how we create new green spaces while avoiding aspects like green gentrification. So everybody has access to a park, but everybody has access to nature. That is paired with some of the bio blitzes that we do in the city that gets schools, K through 12 children, as well as members of the public that are adults, out into their urban nature to document birds, insects, plants, mammals, the whole nine, right? So Reimagining SF just launched this past fall where we are hoping that many of the initiatives that we do over the next 5 to 10 years will increase people's access to green space and hopefully will also increase their overall health and well-being.
Did we want to go with questions from the nothing online, but let's go for the audience.
Yeah.
I can go over in the
Hi, thank you for such a phenomenally engaging presentation. It was just fabulous to watch you talk. So when I saw that image where you comparing the two neighborhoods, one that had a lot of green space and one didn't, the question that came to my mind was population density. Which one of those is more or less dense? And then have you done any work regarding like population density and green spaces and kind of that balance between encroaching on wildlife spaces versus having enough green spaces within the urban setting and thinking about population density?
We have, yeah. So population density is a funny metric because sometimes there is some relationship between what species we find and how many people are there. That's not always the case. So that neighborhood that you just saw that was green lined, that was part of Berkeley's campus. And there are a lot of students on campus, quite a bit. And there are a lot of students and a lot of people in Berkeley that hike up into the Berkeley Hills. But we know from our camera trap surveys that most of the mammalian species we're able to document are up there too. So one of the recent papers that the postdoc in the lab, Christine Wilkinson, just led was one on human-coyote interactions across a gradient of environmental pollution burden as well as socioeconomic status, and found that these areas that tend to be more green, that aren't as densely populated, they also have tons of recreational parks, like Golden Gate Park, that are visited very frequently. That's also where most of the conflicts tend to happen. So most of the conflict reports that we've received, and by we, I mean San Francisco Animal Care and Control, who we worked with on the project, most of those reports were in wealthier neighborhoods. And part of the reason that we think that was the case, two things. One, in the wealthier neighborhoods, they have greater access to larger, more contiguous green spaces where the habitat quality is higher. Coyotes are bougie too. Two, the folks that live in those neighborhoods feel greater agency to make reports. Not only that, they have greater access and they know the pathway to make a report on a coyote when they see it, even if the conflict wasn't actually conflict. So for instance, somebody may say, oh, I had a conflict with a coyote, and they saw it across the street. That happens so many times. So yeah, there is this intersection between how the animals are perceived and who has access to green space and where the green space is located, which that's a whole level of complexity that we, maybe for another talk, we can get into that, right, Kaylee? We can get into like human carnivore interactions, because that's a can of worms that really will help us dig into like how certain animals and people are perceived to be okay in occupying spaces, but others aren't. Case in point, many folks that are in wealthier neighborhoods have outdoor cats. This is my daily PSA to y'all. Keep your cat indoors. Why? Because cats, no fault of their own, are the most efficient killers on the planet, right? They take out so many native birds, reptiles, amphibians, rodents. And in these nature spaces, they are perceived to exist and have the right to exist, the privilege to exist in these green spaces. But when I, a wildlife biologist, sets up a wildlife camera trap, I get looks left and right. They have more agency in a green space than I do. I'm just leave that at that.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
The types of animals that come into the urban areas. For example, in Toronto, we get opossums, and opossums are in the city because they eat rats. Won't find them in the country. For example, where I live, we get cotton-tailed rabbits in the city, but you need wetlands for snowshoe rabbits. And so we won't find them in the city. So if we're talking about an ecological balance throughout the world, say, or the country, or or an urban area. How do we go about doing that? Do we have wetlands within our cities? Do we, any ideas? I'd just like to hear yours.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. We do need wetlands in our cities. That's an urban planning question. So for the folks that are in urban planning, that is right up your alley. Redesigning the city to have it be a city as part of nature, inside of nature, rather than separate from it, is one that has been a prevailing thought from folks like Scott Sampson, who's the CEO at Cal Academy, to many great thinkers like Ed Young, who you're going to see next week. Yep, to a bunch of folks that are part of several governments across the globe, including Singapore, which for urban ecologists is the Mecca, because that is one of the defining cities that's built inside of nature. They did so much redefining of how they think about built infrastructure with blue and green infrastructure that they single-handedly were able to build a city that brought back threatened species in the river otter that they have there. So the smooth-coated river otter came back after they did a lot of kind of work on the channels that existed and removed a good chunk of the concrete and put in more vegetation that allowed for more naturally flowing rivers, which is exactly what the otters wanted, right? So rebuilding the city, like thinking about, well, what did the area look like before the city was built? And then how can we reintegrate some of those elements back into the fabric of the city?
I believe we are at time, but thank you, Dr. Schell, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you.
Echoing that, thank you so much, Chris. What a treat. What a treasure. And I don't know. And a big round of applause for Monica. Great job with the Q&A. You did great. We have, again, one more session in this series with Ed Young. That is next week. Please have a look to join us online. And I really want to thank everybody who's been involved in this series. We are a small but mighty team. First, to our ASL interpreters, Carmen and Liz, thank you so much. To graduate studies and for everybody who works on this, Charity, Stacy, Rakib, Gladys, thank you. And thank you all for coming. And yeah, hope to see you online at the next one. I did the slide. It doesn't do anything. Yeah.